Hello and welcome to this Grief School panel discussion, part of the Good Grief Festival. This session is going to be all about the grief and loss caused by dementia. My name is Stuart Wright. I'm the Dementia Care Lead for Brunelcare, a local provider of nursing and residential care, along with social housing, extra care and community services. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Richard Cheston. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name's Richard Cheston. I'm Professor of Dementia Research at the University of the West of England, and also worked in the NHS for about 25 years as a clinical psychologist, and I still provide a sort of counselling clinic at the Rice Memory Clinic in Bath. Hi.
Thank you. Welcome, Richard. Dr. Kirsten Moore, if you'd like to introduce yourself, Kirsten.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm Kirsten. I have a psychology and sociology background. I've been doing research in dementia and particularly focusing on carers and their grief. I've been working at the Marie Curie Palliative Care Research Department at University College London for the last 6 years. But as you may tell from my accent, I'm originally from Australia, and I've just spent fun time in quarantine in Sydney for the last couple of weeks. But I've finally been let out back into Melbourne, where I'm working at the National Ageing Research Institute and looking at dementia, palliative care, falls prevention, and mental health in older people.
Wow, thank you. Welcome, Kirsten. Dolores Chacon. I hope I spelled it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dolores Chacon, working as the CEO for Bristol Black Carers. I am a registered nurse and have been for 30 plus years, and still registered, working with the carers in the community, and particularly as we're talking about dementia, seeing how that affects them in terms of changes.
Thank you. Welcome, Dolores. And finally, Alan Richardson.
Yeah, good morning. My name's Alan Richardson. I was a former carer for my late mother, who lived with dementia for 15 years. She had vascular dementia as a condition. So it was a very, very long journey that we were on. We cared for her at home all the way through as well. And because of the type of support that we had, when she passed away in 2009, I wanted to volunteer. So I started off volunteering with Crossroads Care. Then I volunteered with, and I still am, with the Alzheimer's Society. I'm involved with young dementia research. I've got a real passion for research, and I've actually seen Dr. Kirsten there. I'm on a project at UCL as well, where Kirsten was, I believe.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome again. So welcome, everybody. It is good to be able to have this time with you so that we can discuss such an important yet difficult subject. It's something that affects the lives of so many people from many different cultures, ages and backgrounds. And as we all are acutely aware, dementia is no respecter of that. Dementia is often described as the long goodbye, with family and friends often saying that their loss of the person starts to happen way, way before physical death actually occurs. Loss and grief are always complex and deeply personal experiences for all of us. But when it comes to dementia, I think the experience is often more complicated by the uniqueness of the journey of dementia, which is often seen as taking a person away piece by piece, and is often, I've heard, described by some of our family members as the disintegration of the self. And in actual fact, when I talk with people living with a dementia, that's often how they describe it, almost a loss from the inside out. It's important, I think, to acknowledge that grief around dementia is not only experienced initially at diagnosis, obviously for the person and their family and loved ones, but continues and evolves throughout that journey and that experience of dementia. I think certainly from my observation in our nursing homes, the challenge of supporting those living there is huge, because the simple act of talking with someone about how they feel often becomes unavailable to us. And for me, that's one of our greatest challenges, I think. Loss and grief around dementia is experienced by all those involved in terms of culture, faith, relationships, role, all of that kind of stuff, I think impacts how we experience, view and manage our grief. And it all adds to the complexity of this experience. So firstly, I'd like to ask, and I'm happy for all of you obviously to contribute because you'll all have differing perspectives. So Kirsten, if we can start for you, and the reason I'm doing that is simply because that's the order you are on my screen, just so you guys know that. I'd like us to describe what this kind of grief is like. How is it experienced? And I think if between us we can touch on how that grief is experienced by, firstly, the person living with dementia, their family, and also just not forgetting formal caregivers as well, because I see that impact as part of my experience in my work. So Kirsten, can I invite you to kind of tackle that from your perspective, please?
Yeah, well, a lot of my research on this area has been with my fellowship that I did for the Alzheimer's Society, where we interviewed 150 family carers. So I'm mainly coming from the family carer perspective. We interviewed carers at all different stages of dementia who had different relationships and across the UK. So we got quite a diverse view from different carers. But often that experience has a lot of similarities and a lot of consistencies in what people say about the loss of relationship, the confusion that it creates around someone being there but not being there. That long goodbye is a really common phrase, and also people talking about multiple grieving processes. I think rather than being a clear point in a distinct death happening and then you have a grieving process, is that people experience multiple losses over time, and so they sort of adjust to one loss and then another loss happens. So it's kind of this sort of, something that you just have to keep adapting to over time, and I think that just creates a lot of challenges and makes it quite challenging.
Yeah, it's like a shifting sand, isn't it, almost, for people? So
yeah, you just sort of get a grasp and you get used to a situation. You think that you've adapted and we're understanding what's happening now, and then something new comes along that they have to adapt to again. So it's just quite wearing. I think that carers sort of get worn down by that constant need to adapt.
Yeah. Thank you, Kirsten. Richard.
Yeah, my own research, my own clinical work is often focuses on people who are living with dementia who've received the diagnosis themselves that they have a dementia. And I think the question of what kind of grief is this? Well, it's the same type of grief as I think we would find really for anyone really facing an uncertain future, but one that I think many people they would see as a terminal illness. In that sense of this is an incurable progressive illness. Grief comes in a form of shock, denial, protest, anger, reconciliation. I think what might make it different in many ways, I suppose, would be a number of things. One of which is the sheer enormity of it. One of the ways we construe things is the dementia is an existential threat. It threatens us on so many different levels, as you mentioned earlier. Concerns about loss of self and identity. So in other things that are fundamental to ourselves, independence, relationships, a sense of meaning and purpose. So that sense there of it just being overwhelming. And I think for many people I work with, it's trying to find a way of allowing them to acknowledge both change, but also continuity. We think of the work as about being the same, helping people to be the same. They're still the same person, but they are different. They've changed in some way. It's not been my task as a counsellor or therapist at Rice is often about trying to help people both to acknowledge at all that they've changed. I think for many people it is such an enormous thing. Such a difficult thing to face. But the temptation is to push it all away, and at the same time to help them to find themselves, to hold on to themselves, and that they are still the same person. So it's that being the same but different, I think, is the task that people have often faced with in their anticipatory grief. And that's then compromised by a number of things, one of which is cognitive impairment. You've already said, it becomes harder for people to find words to put their internal world into some sort of meaning.
Yeah.
It's also the social situation, who's around you, that is fundamental, and all of the usual things that we'd be familiar with from other contexts where people might try to protect people around them or respond. Some couples, it can be very difficult. So we have that. So we have the cognitive concept, the social context, but there's also that personal context, and some will vary in our resilience and our own emotional styles. So all of that plays a part in how people express grief.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Thank you. And Dolores, your thoughts on what this kind of grief is like from your perspective, please.
Well, the grief for me, from my perspective, is starting with the carers, because that's who we normally work with, and it's the process before diagnosis. And they go through the anger, the denial, they're not recognizing what was happening. And then when they do find out, they are very, what must I say, accuse themselves of not being and supporting properly, and then still struggle with the fact that, is this who I know this person to be? And then not understanding the process that is going through. Again, another state of denial where we get people saying, oh, this person is too lazy, or this person doesn't want to help themselves, not realizing that they don't know how. So I believe we are not helping the people around, most of all, to understand the process that is going through, because they are feeling guilty. They are really going through a long guilt process of not being able to support that person properly.
Yeah.
And as a carer, it's hard to see the person shelling away and not coming to terms with that concept. Or if even if you come to terms with it, you can't deal with it because it's a massive loss of what the person was to who they are becoming now. And seeing an adult functioning like a child who took care of you as a child is difficult.
That role reversal, I think, adds that extra dimension, doesn't it?
Yes.
Completely, yes. Thank you, Dolores. Thank you. Alan, can I have your thoughts? And I know this is deeply personal for you.
Yes, and I've got no qualms about sharing the journey either. We often wondered, why didn't we notice things? Because, say, my late mother's journey was 15 years, and we were on a family holiday, and the same place we've been going regularly, only in this country, same place. And the one night we went there, she turned around and said, I don't like it here, where are we? And we thought, that's really, really strange. We hadn't noticed anything. We went straight back the following day to our doctor. Saw our doctor. We were quite fortunate because he was a geriatrician as well. And he asked a couple of questions. He'd known us as a family. And say, within a short period of time, she was diagnosed, my late mother was diagnosed. We were a little family unit as well. But we didn't know really where we would turn or things like that at the time. A little bit of blame on yourselves. Why didn't we notice things? And then you talk to friends, and friends turn around and they say, oh, we noticed that your mother was repeating things that they don't like to say. And that's the benefit of things like this today. How do you deal with it? The way that we dealt with it was we had a little family get together, and we thought, well, we're going to be starting a new beginning. And so grief sometimes can be like two griefs: the person that you knew and the new way of doing things. But quite honestly, when people used to talk to him when we were out and about, we tried to keep things as normal as we could. We wouldn't have known there was anything wrong. Someone would come and say, hello, how are you today? And she'd start crying. The reason that was happening was the signals that were happening with her. And that could be family members as well. So we had to sort of work out for ourselves, how would we deal with this? We got books from the library, we got other things like that. But on a day-to-day basis, you wouldn't have noticed things. We still went on family holidays. Mm-hmm. We tried to keep things as normal as we could. but we referred to it as our journey. And it was like a journey. It was like you were driving down the main line, or you're on a train, you're going down the main line, you go off to a station.
Mm-hmm.
And that would happen with the changes that happened in her condition.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. That journey idea really resonates with me personally, and what I see with many of the people we provide care and support for. And I think that's a helpful way to almost construct the grief around, isn't it? It is one step, and maybe you take some steps backwards. So thank you very much for sharing that. My next question for all of you really is, because the loss and the grief around dementia is, although there are many, many similarities because it is a process as human beings we experience, there is something particularly unique. And all of you have touched on that uniqueness in some ways in your first answer. But thinking about some of the extra difficulties that create challenges for people in terms of their grief around or loss around dementia, particularly in relation, I guess, to culture, spirituality, the messages we get from the media, well-meaning friends who kind of say, well, we noticed, that those kinds of things that all impact us, the stigma or the expectations of others. How do you think all of those things impact people's ability to navigate through this journey as Alan described it? I'm going to change up the order a little bit. And Dolores, can I ask you to come to that first, please? All of those things, how do they contribute?
Well, they either support or become an obstruction.
Right.
Because in terms of religion, you would, in our community, they would say, well, God will take care of this.
Yeah.
And you constantly keep waiting and waiting and waiting. And then you have friends saying things to you, and that's not my mother, would be kind of the responses that you get. So it causes a lot of conflict within the individual, because they notice things have changed, but they don't know how to deal with it because they didn't have the information. And with us now talking more about dementia, is allowing people to look at things differently in a more positive light rather than a negative, because half the times we tend to hide when people are ill around us and end up taking on extra work for ourselves because we don't want other people to know.
Can I just ask, picking up on that a little bit, particularly culturally, is there an added embarrassment or shame potentially in the families that actually gets in the way of in different cultures, do you think?
Yes, definitely, because I know of a family who put their mother in a care home and told the friends that she is staying with another relative. Wow. So that no one could go and visit her for them to know that she had dementia. Mm-hmm. Because they themselves didn't accept it.
Yeah, an extra complication in terms of the grieving process.
Exactly. And friends and family were really upset when they found out, because they could have gone and helped her mental health by going down memory lane with her. But she was cut off from people. Right.
So adding to that isolation. Thank you, Dolores, for that. Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I'd pick up on this sense. I mean, I think potential for shame and embarrassment are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. It's not, certainly the people that I work with, I think this is a very big thing. That sense, people living with dementia are often terribly aware of how others perceive them. Or the danger or the threat of, as Dolores said, not being, that's not Fred, that's not Bert, that's not Courtney. It's and therefore hanging on to dignity in oneself. In the and phrase, very nice phrase, is in the eyes of others. We want to be a dignified person in the eyes of others. And I think from my position, so my work at so my research and also my clinical work often is about trying to help people to maintain that dignity, but also to name the dementia, to name the Alzheimer's, and that's for many people that's a very difficult thing. I mean, we've touched on some Van Dolores has touched on, that there are now social forces. There are people I've been on to meet someone called Keith Oliver, and there are others who are living with dementia and are very open about it and employed by the Alzheimer's Society as ambassadors. And I think that does help. We have a sort of post-diagnostic course, which includes extracts and conversations and videos sometimes from people who are talking about their own experiences. And I think that they're great ways to encourage this wider debate. But I think that pressure to be the person that you others want you to be often is part of that process of why for many people it's hard to acknowledge their dementia. It's hard to put a name to it. And that is a very vital thing. Once you can help couples, families to begin to talk together about what is happening to them, then I think that's quite an important point to do. One of the questions that I ask often of families and couples is, who have you told? What have you told? And when did you tell it? Helping people to begin to have conversations about their dementia is really important. But that often feels a bit like giving up control. So it's important to emphasize for people ways that they can choose who they tell and what they tell and when they tell.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. And I'd like to pick that up with Alan, please, if I may. How was that for you in terms of the challenges and the expectations of other people around your caring role, and also obviously your mum's journey with dementia?
Yeah, I think one of the things we really learned in the early days was it can affect anyone at any time. My late father, he was an ambulance driver for 35 years. And he was still a driver. He'd been a driver for about 10 years when Mum was diagnosed. And we used to keep saying to ourselves, why do we really notice things like that? But we tried to keep things as normal as we could, and picking up on some of the things that Dr. Cheston has just been saying. We explained to people at the start. We didn't want people to have the fear if Mum did something that was a bit unusual, that they would be concerned. And we didn't really fully understand the short-term retention of some of the things to be doing. You just wait there a minute, Mum, while we get the car out. Where is she? And things like that. So it is really important, and it's lovely that people talk about it now. Family members sometimes find it hard. Because they're recognizing the person that they knew as well. I did have friends who had family members with dementia. And one of the things that comes out of it is each one of those dementias is unique in its own way. But why could we sit down and watch a TV program, and on that TV program, you get like a numbers game, and Mum was sat next to us, and she was doing the numbers quicker than us. You'd have a word search coming on, and we'd be filling that out as well. I think the important thing is to involve as many people as you do in the early days to discuss what's going to be happening, because at times people may not realize that you're sort of stressed. Sometimes you yourself, you don't always show it. Right towards the end of our journey, people turn around to me, because my late father passed away halfway through our journey, and they said, "Well, we noticed you were feeling tired." I wish they'd said to me, "You were feeling tired." And I think that's a really important thing, is what's happening now. Dementia is a thing that's talked about now, and the sort of things that are going on with research. We used to keep calendars. I kept calendars of the day-to-day conditioning, whether it be nutrition, moods. I had codes that people wouldn't have recognized on the calendars hanging up. And those I'm sharing now, because there's certain things that people do, you do it naturally, and it's only later on you realize those benefits.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Thank you. Kirsten, from your perspective, the difficulties, the challenges that come up in the modern world, and particularly this theme of not being able always to talk about it, how do you see that?
Well, the things that I think in terms of people talking about recognizing grief is really important. And I think, we have lots of cultural ways that we recognise and start a grieving process. And usually that begins with some sort of ritual or a funeral. So we sort of come together as a social network, and that's sort of an official sort of starting point of showing support for each other and coming together to support each other. And this is what doesn't happen when you haven't had that process and haven't had a physical death. So it becomes very difficult. There's I don't like to sort of use sort of terminology that mightn't be people familiar with, but a term disenfranchised grief sort of gives a good idea of a type of grief that if people don't recognise there's been a loss, or they don't recognise a relationship exists, then it's difficult for them to recognise that someone might be grieving. And so it might make it hard for people's friends and family to recognise someone is grieving, and therefore it means that your normal supports aren't sort of brought together to help you through your grieving process. So I think that's a unique feature in grief for any carer, sort of, or anyone going through a terminal illness and gradually going through losses. But I think over that sort of longer term that dementia happens is particularly important, that recognising the grief, I think is yeah.
I think for me that, sorry.
Yeah, that people, some of the carers I've spoken to is just sort of say, no, it's wrong to call it grief. It's not grief. It can't be grief. And yet the things that they describe are all this terrible loss of their relationship, the loss of their self. They're saying, I so miss my spouse or my wife. She's not the same person. I don't feel this is my wife anymore. And at the same time, they're saying, no, it's not grief. So I think allowing people to say it is grief is such an important point, and sort of to say that, yes, we can call this grief. It mightn't be the way we expect it to be, but it is still loss.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kirsten. I think that idea of what you've described as disenfranchised grief often is compounded perhaps after death, isn't it? With that confusion around, I'm relieved, or other people say it must be a relief, but actually where does that sit, in that process of coming to terms with everything that's happened along that journey? Is that something that people come up against a lot at physical death as well?
Yeah, I think there's an expectation that people feel like they've done the grieving process. So they think that it's going to be, well, that's done and dusted. Things will be easier after death. But I mean, everybody's different, aren't they? For some people, all the emotions and the grief they've been living with for so many years can be exacerbated and brought much to the out again, and a whole lot of new grief. And also we find that there's new things to grieve. So people say that the nature of the relationship has changed. They feel the person with dementia, they're almost a new person that they've learnt to know, and so they have lost yet another person in a way, this sort of newer person with dementia. But they've also lost perhaps a caring role that's become part of their new identity in looking after someone, and how they feel like they're valued and their role in life. And so that role can be another loss that they deal with after the death as well.
Yeah. Alan, is that something that you experienced? Can I ask, please?
Yeah. The grieving process, as has rightly been pointed out, when we, right the way through the journey, we try to explain to Mother that I was two people. I was her son, but I was also her carer. And by becoming the carer, it made it a little bit easier later on when we had to have a certain package put in place to support us. Those people that came in, and I think this is an important thing as well, particularly with the carer, later on when they came in, Mother had regular people coming in to see her. Who did I have coming in to see me? Yeah. They become your new people. People can choose how they want to care for someone as well, or the situation.
Yeah,
starts that journey up again. It starts that journey up again when you suddenly can become you're back on the main line, because things have radically changed. Something radically changed for us for 2 years. Mother couldn't go out for the last couple of years of her life. So it was how to make that right. And we all find our own ways of doing things like that. And I think if you can think a little bit further down the line for when things do change, try and think, what will I be doing afterwards? How can I cope with this afterwards? I mean, when you're caring for someone for 7 or 8 years, left employment to do it as well, you find that everything's changed. Technology has come here and things like that. I would have been lost going back to do that, which is why I wanted to continue by volunteering.
Yeah.
I saw that as my way of coping, A, from her memory, and B, acknowledging the support that people have given to us during that time as well. I know that's always not possible for everybody, and sometimes it can take 2 or 3 years for people used to say, you don't well up and things like that with your eyes and things like that. I say, well, no, because we had that journey. It can be a short journey for some people, and it can be a longer one.
Thank you, Alan. That continuation, I think, sometimes is really important, isn't it? That transition period from being that carer as a family member into perhaps back into some sort of life that becomes your own identity again, I think is really important.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you. For the researchers amongst us, I'd really like to know, because as a dementia care lead, although I'm in health and social care, I often find it really difficult to access the research that would really help, me do my work better. So it would be interesting to spend a few moments, really, firstly with the researchers, to think about what have you learnt in your research about this kind of grief. And then secondly, I guess from Anna-Loris and Alan's point of view, how helpful and how easy is it to access that knowledge? So if I can come to Kirsten and Richard first, what have we learnt from your research? And how helpful do you think it's going to be to immediate family and then people working in health and social care? Richard, could I address that to you first, please?
Yeah, hi. Well, it's a problem, isn't it? What do we learn from research that we can all agree on and take forward, that, and then people, who are the, face of things can use? I think one of the big, and for me a very welcome trend has been the acknowledgement of emotions, and including grief for people living with dementia is really important, and that's changed. So for just a very basic way of understanding the neuropsychology that Alzheimer's disease, the organ we would call it, it's called the hippocampus, where new short-term memories is laid down, is a center of a sort of neurological problem. So hence people struggle to learn new information. But other parts of the brain, including the parts that are concerned with processing emotions, are relatively well preserved. Therefore, somebody may forget that they've met you before, but they'll probably remember whether they like you or not before.
Yeah.
Or they like you. So, we have this, therefore emotions become so important, and therefore, to help people to process, to resolve their emotions becomes important. So alongside that, I think one of the things in research, and our researchers try to put into this, is about the nature of threat, and also about adjustment. So we shouldn't be talking about phrases of people lack insight or in denial. But we're talking about, well, how can we help people to process, to make sense, to come to terms with, to adjust to their illness. So those are important things. And in terms of, certainly, I think when maybe later we'll talk about people who have more severe impairments. Now we might think about that. But certainly one of the messages we try and get across in our training, in our research, is about the importance of talking about it, having a conversation. And certainly when I started in the health service back in a long time ago now, I think it was very rare that we would even tell people of their diagnosis. That was often what we'd tell the family, possibly, but goodness gracious, we may even not come to a formal diagnosis. Now that's all changed. And I think best practice now is widely acknowledged that we should be, when we make a diagnosis, we need to communicate, and we need to put the person with the illness at the center, and then ask them how would they like to know, have their family around them. So that's shifted quite a lot. It's an awful long way to go with that, but I think that trying to help people to adjust to it. our work is trying to, we shouldn't just be thinking about reminiscence. We shouldn't just be thinking about stimulating people, but we should be thinking about adjustment and talking, finding a name, finding a way to bring that person's dementia into conversation. People have said it's enormously distressing. It is often very challenging, but it is so important to try. Not everyone can do it, and in many cases we shouldn't be doing it, but where we should, to try to have a conversation. How is your dementia today?
Yeah, I ascribe to that personally. I think that's really important, Richard. And that is one fantastic thing to come out of research, because at least you feel that that question is validated. It's evidence-based to some degree. Thank you. Kirsten.
I think it's a great question. And I think often I feel a lot of pressure as a researcher. I think people think that we're going to come up with some magical solution to all the world's problems. And I guess a better way of sort of thinking about it and sort of making it feel less overwhelming is actually it's sort of there's a massive beach of sand, and really each research study and each bit of research is just one tiny grain of sand in that massive beach. And so we're just contributing to that, and we build up this story over time that gradually changes. And I think some of the points Richard's making about how much we've learned about dementia and how we work with people. I mean, you don't have to go too far back to people who had dementia weren't sort of eligible or weren't engaged in research as participants. We didn't even ask to talk to people with dementia, and I think gradually that is getting much better. And now it's an ethical standard that people should have the right to be engaged in research, and we should be seeking views of people with dementia more directly. It does get quite challenging in more advanced stages when the person might have difficulty communicating, but I think certainly in the earlier stages we're getting much better at talking to people with dementia and getting their views as well. I guess personally from my direct research that I've been doing in this area, sort of learning more about, there's not been a huge amount of research about carer grief in dementia in the UK. So what are the cultural experiences? What are people's experiences of services? So, sort of highlighting some of the gaps that we found, some of the issues people have with accessing services, people feeling that healthcare professionals are not always recognising their grief, or not recognising that they might need support in their own rights, and even that carers are often not listened to by services as even having a view about the person with dementia. Often still they might be getting overlooked as well. So, and also my study sort of looked at sort of characteristics that to help us sort of understand grief. So we found that women had much higher levels of grief than men. People who had felt that they had lower social networks and social supports were struggling much more with their grief. So we were hoping that some of the more modern things that we might be able to change. We were looking at things like preparing for end of life, talking about end of life, whether that had any relationship with grief intensity, but we didn't find that those things did have a strong relationship. So, which was a bit disappointing, because that would have helped us then guide and inform services about, well, if we know that this might be a way of helping people cope with grief, if we can get them to be talking about what might happen in the future, how they're going to plan for the future and to face the future. Because I think while people are going through a grieving process through dementia, there's also is this big anticipation of what the end will be like. And I think a lot of people are very terrified about what that will look like and what that will involve. So I think sort of giving people a bit of a roadmap or a guide or a discussion or thinking about the future to sort of feel like that they feel like that's not such an overwhelming thing might help them to process and deal with their grief now. Some research has shown that that more sort of there's various terms, prolonged grief disorder or a more disordered form of grief after death has been associated with not feeling prepared for end of life. So so that was sort of the sort of theory or area that I was looking at in my particular study. So I think there's more work on looking at that connection between dementia and end of life and preparing for that. Because I don't think a lot of people still consider dementia as something that you can die from. I think that's still a major issue.
Yeah.
It's now the leading cause of death in the UK.
Yeah, I think often people miss the fact that dementia is a life-limiting or terminal illness, and that does seem to get in the way. Just a personal question to you, really. Do you think that the fact that often we are dragged into the present all the time with people living with the dementia prevents us, becomes a barrier from that future planning, because we're always having to live in the now and adjust to the now?
Yeah, certainly. I think, I mean, a number of carers have said, I just don't have time to think about the future. I'm straight. Yeah, it's so overwhelming just dealing with today and just being in today that I can't even think about the future. But also I think there's a lot of people that sort of say that just don't want to think about the future as well. You know, I've often heard things like, oh, we don't talk about care homes because that will make it happen, or we don't want to talk about death because that will make it happen. So I think there is a lot of fear about talking about those things and thinking about those things as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I think that's a massive taboo culturally, you know, to talk about death and dying. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you. And Dolores, how does research and what we learn from research impact your work?
Well, the first thing I would like to say is that there is research out there, but it's not reaching the right people.
Right.
Right. We have research, we have results, the clinicians, the professionals have access to it, but the actual people delivering and working with dementia don't have that information. And as simple as it sounds, you know, saying all that we've said and have that available for somebody to sit down and listen to is the first step that we can get people to start thinking about things. Because you go in, you get a diagnosis, you go home, somebody send you a piece of paper to read, somebody visit you on a one-off situation, and that's the end of it. And they're left hanging, but nobody has given them an understanding of what the process will be.
Yeah.
And people think they don't have time to do that. So then let's use technology to give them the time to access to do so. If it means the person comes into a GP practice for a certain period of time and look at a video telling them blah, 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 or in the care home where they have someone to explain what has been said, then the research will become alive. Right now, for me, most of it is sitting on a shelf.
And that's really, really hard, isn't it?
Yes.
Not only for us as healthcare professionals, but I'm guessing to come to Alan, and I know that you've gone on to get involved in research. It's a passion of yours. Thank you, Dolores, for making my point for me as well. I appreciate that. Alan, your thoughts, please. Obviously, you've gone on to get involved in research, but initially, when you were caring with your mum, how did research impact you? Did it help?
Yes, certainly. I always think that things can happen that you're not really sure why you do them. I said about the calendars earlier on. One of the things that talking to our GP at the time was that we needed to monitor how Mum ate, what her moods were. I mentioned the moods and that sort of thing earlier on. I developed these codes: Q for quiet day, A for active day, N for normal. Because some days things are fairly normal. You know, how I ever thought that 6 years, 8 years on afterwards, I'd be using these and giving talks. But I was interested in some of the comments earlier on because I'm currently on a research project, which is to do with, and I'm developing a tool to maintain compassion for carers and the understanding of it. Yeah, there's research projects taking place, and there's some end-of-life ones as well. It's very hard topics for people to talk about, and it's to break these barriers down and understand. The more people that can share their stories, the better. That's the better for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And hearing Anne-Louise just now, how can we actually put that over? Not everybody has got technology. Specialisms, I think if people looked at research going back, I hope I'm right on this, maybe 10, 15 years ago, how many people chose dementia to move into? What convinced me was being sat with 3 students at a dinner one evening, and they were researchers. And I got listening to them, and I thought, oh, I'd like to get, you know, this is an opportunity here. We've all got our stories.
Mm-hmm.
If there's small things in our stories that can help, that can be really, really so powerful. And the passion of the people that are doing it too. You have got technology that you can look at. I mean, you can go on and you can put anybody's name in now, or any university or anything like that. Put it in and see what studies are taking place. But it's the importance is how can you share that, and how can you get more people involved. There's an interesting thing at the moment which is called What is Health Research. It's something done by the National Institute of Health Research, and I'm lucky enough to have been approached by them, a big part of it. And it's explaining what that is,
mm-hmm.
and it's a free course to access, and they're sharing so many stories, and well, like you're doing today, there's only one thing that someone may pick up from our conversations or our chat, but that could be so important. And if that can break the barrier, we've then arrived in the siding, haven't we, at the end of our journey?
Absolutely. Thank you, Alan. Thank you. Okay. Just coming back to something that Richard kind of touched on, the importance of actually talking to a person living with dementia about their experience. For all of you, really, just to think about. For people, especially further on in their journey, we've talked about communication being so important in terms of being able to name the dementia, name the feeling and the emotion. But what happens, and it's something that we deal with in care homes particularly every day, and this idea that I have, and you know, the sad thing is when you're so busy, you end up working in isolation. And this idea of unresolved grief for people living with a dementia at the point where cognition is so impaired, and the ability to communicate is so impaired, and yet that grief still exists within inside that person, and then it is demonstrated in terms of behaviours. I think, first of all, Alan, how did you cope with that? I'm making a big assumption here, but you know, how do you cope with that? What do you do to help that person move to a place of more calm, less distressed, to be able to express what's going on inside?
I think it's understanding the person's story as well. And with memory can be an amazing thing. Things can be, I remember my late mother one day, we went to her old primary school and bumped into some people that had been there before. And there was this lady there that was the same age, I would have thought his mother. The school children were there, and she turned around and she gave this lady's name straight out. Now that had been locked away. Lots of things are locked away. Engagement is very important. And also I'd like to say that I'm glad that we tried to keep things as normal as we could and have normal day-to-day discussions during our journey. But what actually has amazed me over the last few years is going along, sitting down, having a cup of coffee with someone, not knowing who they were, and finding out that person was living with dementia.
Yeah.
There's only something that they may ask you to do. And former carers have got a really important part to play here. If people can involve former carers that have been on, I'm not going to use the word journey again, but they've experienced things like that. And when people can get together at whatever it is, whether it's an event, whether it's a teleconference, whether it's something else, or it's even or you're even out in the street and you're talking to friends, and someone will turn around and say, "You looked after someone that had dementia. I'm a bit concerned about it." Would they have said that 20 years ago?
Yeah.
So I think that research and what's been happening, the fact that the topics are being talked about, I'll give a real big tick to that, because if that had been about when our journey was about, there isn't things that we'd necessarily have done differently. But I'm just glad that we did things in the way that we did, and not everybody would be able to do that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Alan. Thank you. Richard, you did mention this idea of unresolved grief. Would you like to say a little bit more about how we can help people living with a dementia when they're locked in that state?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned residential care, and I every time that when I was working as a clinical psychologist and would be asked to go into a residential care setting, I think the one thing, or if there was going to be one thing that I would want to say that comes from research and is about grief, would be to ask people working there, or carers and former carers, about how they manage loss, how they manage security, particularly how they help. We're all doing this all the time, aren't we? So if you parent who takes their kid to a nursery and takes back, you have all of those things about the sense of loss and grief, and all of those things there are then present in the person living with dementia in a home. How do you manage that sense of essentially insecurity? Most of us get it from our relationships. We've talked a lot about the importance of relationships here, but and this does relate to grief because it's about loss, and loss makes us feel insecure. Loss makes us feel abandoned and so forth. So how do we do that? Now, for some people, it's about people living with very severe forms of dementia might go back and try and go home. And when you find out where home is where they lived 30, 40, 50 years ago. Other people would think that their mothers or fathers are still alive and coming to meet them. And again, isn't that about loss? Isn't that about security? That we have to create an idea of mum or dad still being there to rescue me. Yeah. For other people, and Alan was saying about creating a normal routine. For many people, it's routine that gives life structure and purpose and meaning and security. And for other people, they will express that by calling out, asking for help, asking for comfort. And how often is that unattended, that people just see it as part of the illness rather than as part of grief, part of loss, part of insecurity? So we all express in our different ways our needs for love and comfort and for reassurance in different ways. And in dementia, one of the cruel things is that we've tended to normalize that by seeing it as a symptom. And it's not a symptom of dementia, it's a symptom of grief, it's a symptom of loss. That's how we express it. And residential homes that I would go into would be full of people trying to make themselves feel better, trying to make themselves feel better. So if there's one bit of research that I would try and get, it's the research around, we would call it attachment. But that's the thing to do, and that attachment isn't just about toddler, it's also about the middle-aged couples finding love and security. It's about how, and it's also about the people in their 70s and 80s who are living with dementia. So that's, I think, the big thing. And we said before, grief and loss is ongoing because every day you confront something you can't do, something that makes you different in yourself or in your partner. And every day it's inevitably unresolved, but we can still attend to it. That's the important thing.
Thank you, Richard. I think what I take away from that is attend to the person in their pain. Thank you. And Dolores, would you add anything to that, particularly from a cultural perspective?
I would add to that is a matter of communication, because I have a young couple. Well, the husband is much older than the wife, and he has developed dementia from his alcohol abuse in the past. Now they have a young child, and there is always a problem of communication because the wife didn't understand what was happening to him and how long it has been going, and she keep having arguments that affected their relationship. And the arguments seemed one-sided because the husband has no recollection of whatever the discussion took place before. And I said to her, you have to realize that he is in a bubble when you are talking to him about that at that point in time. And he cannot step out of that bubble no matter how you try to make him remember, because he's enclosed in that memory. And you have to now find a way to relax and cope with dealing with that situation in another way in order to move on, because they are in the house together. The child is there. The child is watching her dad doing things that he should be watching her do. and it was difficult. And when we had that conversation, she said, why didn't anybody point that out to me before? So again, it's talking to people about the stage at where the person with dementia is.
Yeah.
We keep saying to people, oh, remind them about the time, help bring them back to the current time. But that doesn't work for everybody, because not everybody is in that stage to recognize it.
Yeah.
So we need to help people realize that things change every day.
Yeah.
It's not their fault.
Absolutely. It's the importance of meeting someone where they're at, isn't it?
Yes.
Whether it's
and
in
that's what
experience.
Yeah, and that's again with loss, dealing with loss. Why doesn't he remember to do this? Why didn't he remember to put on his shoes?
Yeah.
And it is difficult to say to them, it is at that moment and time that they forgot. And you can't change that, because that is their reality.
Yeah.
And we need to talk to people to help them to understand that is the process that's happening, and differentiate the different stages of dementia, because every single person with dementia presents differently in their families.
Absolutely.
And some people are comparing themselves to others.
Yeah. And of course, that will impact the way that the grief and loss is felt as well, won't it?
Yes, it will. And it will impact on how they respond, because sometimes they angrily respond, not realizing that the person senses that aura and creates agitation as well.
Yeah.
So it's teaching them to stay calm.
Yeah. Emotions are definitely significantly infectious, aren't they? And
yes.
I'm going to come to COVID in a moment, but thank you, Dolores. Kirsten, do you have anything to add around this idea of unresolved grief with people in later stages, or would you echo what Richard said?
Yeah, I think so. I think that issue of people wanting to go home, and what that means, and what I usually say when I work with care home staff is that often they just want security. A sense of security is what they want. That idea of home is unattainable in some respects if they're thinking of a home, when they were children or teenagers, or their parents were alive. So I think it's just thinking about, just reassurance and being where they're at, and rather than where's mum, where's my mum, where's my mum, and rather than saying, well, she died a long time ago, is like, oh, start talking about your mum, and that's what you do with grief, isn't it? Is you sort of reflect and say, well, what are the good memories you have of your mum, and how can you turn that around to a positive thing where they get to sort of explore that person they've lost.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. So we end up really with an approach that kind of encompasses attend, validate, and communicate where possible, really, isn't it? Just to bring that right down. Okay. Thank you. I'd like to just pose my final question. You'll be glad to know. And just from everybody's knowledge and contacts, really, what support is available out there for people who find themselves in the grieving process for someone living with a dementia, or for the person themselves who is living with a dementia? What support is out there? And I guess when you conclude your little input on that, can you just give me your one word of support, advice, or comfort to those people experiencing this kind of grief at the moment? So kind of a bit of a double barrel question, please. And Dolores, can I come to you first, please?
In terms of support out there, it varies according to where you live. It varies according to your GP, because some people say they have fantastic support from the GP. Others say, I don't even bother to go to my GP. Then there are some organizations that are in touch with people that they could have support. But it really, really varies in every single area. And everybody's journey is massively different. And I hope that we will be able to pull things together to get a sort of standardized support for people out in the communities and the care homes, so that we can give them the power to make the difference for the person with dementia and their carers. I forgot your last question.
Okay. Just one word of support or advice that you would give to people who are listening to this, perhaps going through this experience themselves.
the word, we are here to listen.
Yeah. Great.
Listen would be my word.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anne-Dolores. Thank you. Alan, can I come to you next, please?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to sort of finish with there. I'm a great believer that my favorite expression is together we can make a difference. And it is together that people can do things. There is not universally things all over the country that are standard from if you live in A, B, or C. The involvement of people that have experienced something, the involvement of people that are starting to experience as well, that can be oh so important. And you could have someone sat next to you that you don't know. You could go to something like a memory cafe or something like that, or an ordinary cafe. If instead of going to a memory cafe, if people go to a cafe where they're all mixing together, that can be also important. The new normal, people hear about people saying the new normal. Nobody knows what that's going to be. Yeah. I'd just like to add, instead of one word, 3 words: stop, look, and listen. Stop and think. Look for what's out there, and please listen, because there may be something coming forward for you that can really, really help you. And they're simple words.
Thank you so much, Alan. Stop, look, and listen. Thank you. Kirsten.
So I think, services out there have been mentioned. I think Alzheimer's Society has lots of resources. Dementia UK, I think Admiral Nurses, I think we need to have a lot more of them, but if you're lucky enough to have one in your area, they can provide a lot of useful support to carers and people with dementia. I think in our study, we found that over half of the carers, 55%, accessed either GP or counselling sort of professional support for managing grief, which is much higher than grief guidelines and bereavement services suggest is needed. So I think there's definitely people out there are accessing services. So I guess my advice is that it's okay to grieve, to allow yourself to grieve and to not feel guilty about grieving, and also that there's no right way of grieving, that just you need to find the way that works for you and the supports that work for you. Some people find carer support groups useful, some find them horrific. So it's finding what works for you, I think, and the person or the people that are helpful for you, that don't judge you or tell you what to do, but just listen and provide the support you need.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. And lastly, Richard, please.
Well, I'd just echo what other people have said. As Anne-Dolores mentioned, it's incredibly variable. I know a lot of people talk about, when you've, as a professional support carer, when you've met one person or one couple living with dementia, you've met precisely one person, one couple living with dementia. And you could say the obverse when you've received care from one organisation, you've received care from one, and because it is, again, there's huge variation. Some very good, often much less so. So just be persistent, keep in mind. Services often like to emphasise timeliness. It's not about providing support; it's about providing timely support, and the notion that this will change. I guess if you're out there living with dementia or a carer, then what might feel like timeliness is persistence and experimentation. Things will change, and don't close off avenues. You might be at one point not relevant in your life, not suitable in your life. In a year's time, maybe that's different. So keep yourself open to receiving timely support, and that will change.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thank you all of you for your contributions today. It has been deeply interesting, at moments painful and inspiring as well. Thank you very much. And I'd kind of leave us all, I guess, with Alan's words, really. Stop, look, and listen. and don't forget to stop keeping it all in. Keep talking. Keep your relationships healthy as much as you can. And I think for me, one of the things that helps me in my work in managing the grief that our carers experience, and myself as well, because I have relationships with people living with a dementia, is to remember to see the potential in every single person that you come across, and never write anybody off, and give them every opportunity to express how they feel and experience deep, loving relationships. Kirsten, Richard, and Dolores, and Alan, thank you all so much for your time. I hope to see you all again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everybody.